Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Democracy Lab at the University of Wyoming. I'm Sean Reese. I'm the Executive Director for Wyoming Humanities. The Democracy Lab is designed to be a dynamic, interdisciplinary, intergenerational space to incubate research projects, germinate new capacities, and initiate collaboration. The Democracy Lab will support research production and programs in a collaborative space to engage our communities in the work of improving the quality of democracy and equality. I'd like to give a shout out to my fellow Democracy Lab advisory teammates, Dr. Scott Henkel, who's the Wyoming Excellence Professor in the Humanities and Director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, Dr. Stephanie Anderson, Professor and Department Head of the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies within the University of Wyoming College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Adam Blackler, Professor at the Department of History, College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Kathy Conley, Professor at the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice within the College of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the Wyoming House of Representatives, Sarah Flintner, owner and founder of Flintner Strategies and former mayor of Jackson and lead facilitator for the Endow Initiative to diversify Wyoming's economy. Dr. Jennifer Harmon, professor in the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences within the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Riley Talamantes, current UW student and a former president of the Associated Students of UW, and current project coordinator for the Office of Student Success and Graduation. Dr. Samantha Vandermeed, professor at the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice within the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Chen Zhu, professor at the Wyoming Geographic Information Science Center. And the ever-capable Stephanie Stoll, our project coordinator for the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. I'd also like to give a big thank you to the following sponsors of tonight's launch: the University of Wyoming Grand Challenges Initiative, Wyoming Humanities, UW Honors College, University of Wyoming Alumni Association, the Associated Students of UW, School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice, English Department, American Studies, Philosophy and Religious Studies, School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies, University of Wyoming Libraries, University of Wyoming Press, and the Sheridan College Center for Vital Community. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the Executive Director for Wyoming Humanities. My organization's mission is to strengthen Wyoming's democracy through the humanities. We often lose sight of the connection between the humanities and our democracy. Further, many of us don't know as well as we should our nation's founding documents. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Danielle Allen, was also troubled by the fact that so few Americans actually know what the Declaration of Independence says. She set out to explore the arguments of the Declaration, reading it with both adult Knight students as well as University of Chicago undergraduates. Her award-winning book, Our Declaration, a reading of the Declaration of Independence in defense of equality, looks at the Declaration from a variety of humanist perspectives: language, linguistics, logic, philosophy, ethics and morals, religion, history, prose, the development of an argument, the group dynamics of debate, developing consensus, and group writing. In our declaration, Dr. Allen discusses contradictions within the declaration: its liberation of some while subjugating slaves and Native Americans. And despite these contradictions, she provides a compelling lesson that the Declaration makes a coherent, riveting argument about equality. Dr. Danielle Allen is a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. She is the James Bryant Conant university professor at Harvard University. Dr. Allen is a political theorist who has written broadly about the democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. She is the recipient of the 2020 John W. Kluge Prize for Achievement in the Study of Humanity, an award administered by the Library of Congress that recognizes the work in disciplines not covered by the Nobel Prizes. Without further ado, I'd like to have a warm welcome for Dr. Allen. I will tell our audience, thank you for joining us tonight. And while the chat function is currently closed, we welcome your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that, Dr. Allen, welcome.
Thank you so very much, Sean, and to all of your colleagues as well, Scott and Kathy and Riley. I'm really honored to be with you all tonight and to contribute to the launch of your new Democracy Lab. It's an exciting endeavor, and I'm eager to learn more about the good work that you have planned. I'm going to tell you tonight about some work I had the chance to do with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and then I will also spend a little time talking about the Declaration of Independence. But I want to tell you about this body of work first, because I think it connects to what you're trying to do with the Democracy Lab. So in June of 2020, deep in the pandemic, and as we were approaching the throes of our very difficult 2020 election, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences released a commission report called Our Common Purpose, the Future of Democracy, or Reinventing Democracy rather, for the 21st Century. And I had the great pleasure and privilege and honor of co-chairing the commission that produced that report over several years. We never imagined when we got started that we would be in the throes of that major national crisis at just the point when we wanted to release a report about reinventing democracy for the 21st century. But I want to tell you a little bit about how this report came to be and what's in it, because that will then also tee up my reflections on the Declaration of Independence. So first, a word about the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's an organization that probably most people have never heard of. It's old, it's older than the country, and it was founded by the founders of our country. So people like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were closely involved. And what it is a society that has as members people who are what in olden times I called members of learned professions. So professors and lawyers and doctors, and over time it's expanded to include all professional sectors, business and artists and creative people and philanthropists and former political leaders and the like. But the reason that our founders set up this academy was they knew that their young country, the new republic, would face crises over time, and they believed that it should always be equipped with the best knowledge resources available to provide advice and support as people try to navigate the crisis. So the American Academy of Arts and Sciences is older than the country and was founded with this mission of ensuring that as we faced our hardest challenges, we would always be able to pull together networks of people who could tap into the state of the art of knowledge to provide advice and support for decision makers. Now, several years ago, the president of the American Academy, somebody named Jonathan Fanton, felt that we were facing a crisis in our democracy, and he discovered in conversation with others that others felt that way too. In my own case, my sense that we are facing a crisis in our democracy goes back to 2013. That's the year in which Congress had an approval rating of 9%. And when that approval rating came out in 2013, for me, it was a flashing red light alarm bell going off. Now, why is that? In thinking about what a democracy is and what its purpose is, as you know, it's of the people, by the people, for the people. A democracy is built out of several branches of government, but the first branch of all the branches is the legislative branch. The legislature has the job of articulating the will of the people. The entire purpose of constitutional democracy is to articulate and then execute the will of the people, protecting and enforcing rights as you go. But so if we, the people, approve of Congress at a rate of 9%, that means we, the people, don't approve of our own voice. When that happens, democracy is fundamentally broken. So that was my red alarm bell moment about democracy. And Jonathan Fanton found a number of us who were having these concerns and said, I think it's time for the American Academy to pull together a commission, a bipartisan commission of people from all different professional sectors, different ideological backgrounds and perspectives, different demographic backgrounds. And so we formed a big commission, but we also thought we had, in tackling this sort of question of what's the challenge in our democracy and how we might fix it, we thought we couldn't do the usual thing. It couldn't just be a matter of experts coming together and producing white papers. At the end of the day, democracy belongs to all Americans, and every American has a piece of knowledge and understanding about our democracy and how it's working or not working. We are all experts in our democracy in some fashion or form or another. Our belief was that tackling the hard problems of our democracy required conversation and engagement with Americans from all walks of life all over the country. So we ran listening sessions and really sought to probe the question of what's wrong with our democracy, why are people alienated and disaffected, and what could we do about it? These were extraordinary conversations. Naval cadets, non-voters, as well as voters, older people, younger people, refugees, full range and gamut of experience in our country. And many people said things that brought key ideas to the surface and really crystallized the work that we had. But there was one gentleman in Maine who said something especially powerful that became the heart, the conceptual heart of the work that we did as we tried to think our way through the challenges in our democracy. He said, the problem is we have these institutions that don't really deliver what they promise at all. And so we don't trust them. And when we don't trust our institutions that are not responsive to us, we stop engaging. We don't want to participate. And when we stop participating, well, then we don't get to know each other and we start to distrust each other as well. So it's like a vicious circle. And then he said, but isn't the whole point of a democracy that's supposed to be a virtuous circle? You're supposed to have political institutions that empower people, that are responsive to the voice of ordinary people, and that by empowering people, draw people into participation with each other in civil society organizations that connect them to our political institutions. And when people are drawn into participation together in our civil society organizations, they get to know each other, they form networks, they can bridge across difference. A healthy constitutional democracy depends on a virtuous circle where responsive and empowering institutions are reinforcing the desire to participate in civil society, and they're also by reinforcing a culture of shared commitment to some kind of common purpose. So hearing that from a gentleman in Maine flipped a switch for us on the commission, and we realized our job was to help this country in some sense also flip a switch from that vicious cycle of institutions that we don't trust and withdrawal from civil society participation in a culture of divisiveness and adversarial attacks. We had to flip the switch to a virtuous circle. And so we developed a set of reforms in order to do that. And 3 of the strategies of reform are about fixing our political institutions. One of my favorite recommendations is that we should increase the size of the House, the size of Congress, and I'm happy to talk more about that if you have more questions. We also recommended that there be term limits for Supreme Court justices. And remember, this was a bipartisan group, so these were bipartisan recommendations that we developed. Then there were 2 strategies that really focus on the question of civil society. How do we build organizations that help people bridge divides? How can we have an information ecosystem that gives people healthy information? And then there was the last strategy, and this was my favorite one. This is the one I want to focus on. This is a strategy about culture, and a strategy focused on the question of how do we rebuild a culture, or build for the first time, really, in an important sense, a culture where we recognize that we're committed to each other mutually and all share a commitment to our constitutional democracy. And as we did this work on this last piece about culture, we discovered a real debate in our society. The question was, if we were going to, this was a lot of words, right? To say we would have a strategy about how to develop a commitment to one another and a shared commitment to constitutional democracy. Shouldn't there be one word that sums up what that cultural connection or orientation is? When we tried to come up with one word, we found ourselves involved in a very deep fight. There were some who wanted to say, well, the word should be patriotism. That's what we need to cultivate. And there are others who say, that's not the word. The word should be solidarity. That's what we need to cultivate, a sense of the kind of common good. And as you might imagine, as people put these 2 words on the table, it fell along a very straightforward partisan line. So folks on the right tended to want to lift up the term patriotism. Folks on the left tended to want to lift up the term of solidarity. And we were stuck trying to figure out, how are we going to talk about the cultural work that we have to do with one another? And suddenly we realized another sort of aha moment that there was a way of talking about that bond we could and should have with each other and with our constitutional democracy that worked on both sides of the political line. We realized we could talk about love of country. We realized everybody in our commission, all the people we were talking about, felt love of country. Some people were angry at their country too, but we recognize that from families. I love my family. I get angry at my family too. Love and anger can actually coexist. Love of country, that everybody felt. People had different reasons for loving their country. For some, it had to do with the specific place, the geography, the trees, the mountains, the natural landscape. For others, the people, the culture, music, food, a whole variety of things. For others, our political institutions, the very possibility of free self-government among equal and free self-governing citizens. Many, many reasons. But what we came to realize doing that work is that if we actually want to try to make space to work together again, a thing that we can do is just start by asking one another why each of us loves our country. We can say, I love my country. I know you love our country. Let me tell you why I love our country. You tell me why you do. Let's start from there. Let's put the things we love on the table together and learn from each other about that love. So to the Declaration of Independence, I want to tell you why I love our country. And it really does go back to the Declaration of Independence. I love the Declaration of Independence. And lots of people will say to me, Danielle, how can you? Thomas Jefferson, he was a slaveholder. What about women? Well, Thomas Jefferson was not the only voice in the Declaration. It was in fact produced by a committee. Two of the leading voices in shaping it were John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, both of whom were abolitionists by the time the Declaration was written. The text of the Declaration was used within months by a free African American in Massachusetts, Prince Hall, to borrow on its language to put a petition to the Massachusetts Assembly for the abolition of enslavement. Massachusetts abolished enslavement before the end of the Revolutionary War. So the Declaration of Independence helped crystallize the abolitionist movement in this country. Yes, Thomas Jefferson was the chair of the committee, he was the lead draftsman, but he was only one voice, and the other voices are in the Declaration too. And that's a history we should tell, a history we should share. The Declaration deserves a lot of credit for helping people convene around a commitment to the end of enslavement. But so I want to dig into it specifically and just focus on what I love above all in the Declaration. And that's the second sentence. You know it, I'm sure, but I'll remind you of it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to lay the foundation on such principle and organize the powers of government in such form. I just messed up that last clause, I'm so sorry. But whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principle and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Sorry, I slipped there at the end in that last clause, but I hope you heard the whole sentence. It's really long. We often forget how long it is. We think it ends at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In fact, it goes all the way to the idea that we lay the foundation on principle and organize the powers of government to effect our shared safety and happiness. The sentence starts by saying we all have rights. We build government together to secure those rights. And when government's not working for us, it's our job to alter it in order to secure our safety and happiness. It is the sentence that captures the theory of revolution that those founders did use to justify the revolution and to instituting new government. But it's also a sentence that clearly defines the core responsibility of citizenship. It's our job to survey our circumstances and to ask, are our institutions securing our core rights? How are we defining our core rights? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness are some examples. The sentence says, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's not a complete list. There may be something else. So we have an ongoing debate of how are we going to define rights. We have a job of looking around and asking, is our government securing our rights? And if we think it's not, if it's insufficient in some fashion, then it's on us. It's on us to lay a new foundation, to institute. We lay the foundation on principle, and we organize the powers of government. Principle and process. That's what comes together. That's the work of citizenship. We have to understand both of those parts in order to work together to find a common purpose that can deliver our shared safety and happiness. So I love the Declaration of Independence because it's a call to all of us as equals to participate in free self-governance. And in addition to offering us that call, it gives us a very clear understanding of the job. Understand the principles. What are the core pictures of rights that we need in order to help build healthy and flourishing societies? And then how do we think about process and institutions in order to deliver on securing those rights? It's hard work, hard work, hard work. And in so many ways, we've lost sight of how to do this work. That's why something like the Democracy Lab is just so fundamentally important. We have to come together again and learn again how to do that work of laying the foundation on such principle and organizing the powers of our government in such form as can affect our shared safety and happiness. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Kathy.
Thank you for that. If we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, there would be a room of people clapping for that. So let me be that person. Dr. Danielle Allen, thank you so much for that. Thank you for being with us as we launch the Democracy Lab. Thank you also for all of your work. My first question is going to be about work. The report that you mentioned earlier, Our Common Purpose, the Humanities Institute would be happy to mail a copy of that to anyone who wishes. Just get in contact with us. I'd be happy to do it. A new democracy laboratory. Those of you listening, if you know Dr. Allen's work, you know that she knows the classics backwards and forwards. So I hope you appreciate this first question. Etymologically, laboratory comes from the Latin, a laboratorium. It's a place where people labor. It's a workplace. What is the work of democracy?
Great, no, thank you, Scott. I mean, I think your question just follows perfectly from what I was trying to articulate there about the Declaration of Independence. And the 18th century language can be opaque, it can be hard for us to enter into. But that distinction between thinking about principles and thinking about how we organize the powers of government is really key. Let me just give another example to make that concrete. At the same time that they drafted the Declaration of Independence, they also worked on drafting the Articles of Confederation to provide an instrument, they would call it a legal document, that would help the now states, not colonies, understand their relationship to each other and decision-making processes among them. And as we all know, the Articles of Confederation didn't serve them very well. And soon after the Revolutionary War, nothing was working. They couldn't actually form a budget, kind of like what we're dealing with now, right? Couldn't get the budget done because they couldn't figure out how to get revenue coming in from the states. And as the federal budget was dysfunctional, that resulted in people not coming to Congress. They couldn't get a quorum. They couldn't get anything done. It was a disaster. So a subset of the members of Congress decided to try to move forward a constitutional convention, and they managed to wrangle everybody into participating in that. But when they got to the Constitutional Convention, then they had to figure out what to do. And there's this really interesting moment about halfway through the proceedings where the committee steps aside and asks the question, is the job here, do we have to draft a new statement of principles, or do we just need to draft a new instrument for how we organize the powers of government? Because they'd had both. The Declaration was the statement of principles, and the Articles of Confederation was how they had organized the powers of government. They decided they did not need to draft a new statement of principle, okay? They were happy to stand pat on the Declaration of Independence as the statement of principle guiding their work. And they recognized that all they needed to do was to reorganize the powers of government. They did need a stronger executive. You couldn't get away without having an executive. That wasn't going to work. They became clear on that. That's an example of reorganizing the powers of government. So that's the work of democracy. It's that sort of thought about principle, figuring out how to organize the powers of government to deliver on principle, but then also working through committee processes, working together, wrangling. Those three things together, I think, are the work of democracy.
I'm going to ask a few questions. I already see a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and I do invite your questions and comments there, and we'll get to them in just a bit. Our new Democracy Lab, I'm so grateful that part of it was launched with support from the University of Wyoming's Grand Challenges initiative. So thank you, friends out there. And the task is to think about the hardest problems, the biggest and thorniest questions. UW President Ed Seidel is fond of saying that if a grand challenge can be solved in a decade, it's too small. So we are here to think big.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. In that spirit, in your book, Talking to Strangers, you quote frequently a note that Ralph Ellison made in his notes to Juneteenth. And the original Ellison quote is about racism on the one hand and freedom on the other hand. And I'm going to try to keep the spirit, I hope you hear the spirit of the original quote as I paraphrase to build a little bit more. You know, something to the effect of, it might be racism and sexism and economic inequality, they are not going to go away anytime soon. Therefore, it's up to us to free ourselves by becoming our idea of what a free people ought to be.
Yep.
And there is a grand challenge, our idea of what a free people ought to be. I mean, I'm not asking for a simple answer to what you think about that, but how do we even begin to think about that? What tools do we have in order to begin working on such a hard problem as that?
Yeah. Well, let me give you another quotation back at you. That has always helped me think about that question. This one is from Borges via the poet Frank Bedart. Frank Bedart wrote a poem riffing off of this line from Borges, but we fill pre-existing forms, and when we fill them, we change them and are changed. And I think this is a very related idea. So here we are, whenever we were born, we are born into a world we inherit already. It has its patterns, it has its structures, right? We talk a lot about things like structural racism, for example, and it has its institutions and its bureaucratic procedures and so forth. It's given to us. There's nothing we can do about the world we inherit. We are obliged to fill it, but the way that we fill it can force changes in it and turn it into something else. Though in the process of our bumping up against its rigidities, we too will be changed. Surely it's impossible to avoid. So in that regard, I always understood Ralph Ellison to be saying that while we may have inherited a world full of bad habits of people dominating each other, full of racism, full of sexism, we can, in our imagination, understand different ways of being with people. Right? We can understand a way of being with people where we can all look each other in the eye as equals, nobody having to defer to anybody else, where we share time at a meeting, we share airtime. You know, we don't mansplain or professor-splain or whatever other kind of splain it might be. If we can imagine that, then we can do it even if it goes against the grain. And if we can act against the grain, we can actually drive change for the people around us and change for those structures. That's what I've always understood. And so if we can build a community of people acting against the grain, that's how we can actually bring transformation.
Thank you. You are a beautiful writer.
Oh, that's very generous. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. An inspirational writer to me and to the Democracy Lab team, and we deeply, deeply appreciate it. Also to my students together read our declaration. Shout out to some of the smartest students at the University of Wyoming and in
That's
the history
awesome.
of all time. Did I get right? We noted your beautiful writing, and we also struggled over a few things, and I'm hoping to help you, or excuse me, I'm hoping that you help us to figure out a way through a struggle.
Sure.
The argument of the book is right there in the title,
Yeah.
Our Declaration. And it's not because it's in the title, it's not giving away to read part of the last paragraph of the book. You write, the time has come to reclaim our patrimony and also to pass it on, to learn how to read this text, the Declaration, again, and to bring back to life our national commitment to equality. It's time to let the Declaration once more be ours, as it was always meant to be. And ours is the thing over which we struggled. Some people in the conversation maybe had some questions about ours. So I wonder what you might say to people who doubt that we can really claim the Declaration.
Yeah. So there's so much to say about that. That's a beautiful question, and it's to the point. It absolutely goes to the heart of the matter. And let me just pause for a moment on the phrase reclaim our patrimony. That's what I was doing in the beginning, right? When I told the story about how the Declaration helped crystallize abolitionism. That's not the story we generally tell about the Declaration. The story we generally tell about the Declaration is about Thomas Jefferson, the slave owner. Well, let me tell you another story about Thomas Jefferson, which is the following. If you want credit for something, put it on your tombstone. That's one of the most important lessons Thomas Jefferson has taught us. Why? Because his tombstone says, author, Declaration of Independence. We would not consider him the author. We would not think the text belonged to him if he had not done that. The text came out of a committee process. And John Adams was the actual intellectual architect of the work of that year in 1776, 75 to 76. He drafted text for Massachusetts in January of 1776 that is a rough draft of the structure of the Declaration. If you look at the list of grievances, it's Adams who structured the bulk of it. Jefferson inserted a chunk of stuff about objections to the Quebec Act in the middle of it. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's Adams. Adams gave us that focus on happiness. It's his writing the whole year. He's the only person who was writing about happiness in this way. It displaced property. Property was already being used to defend a quote unquote right to slavery. So John Adams is the true intellectual architect of the Declaration, even if Thomas Jefferson was the draftsman. How did Thomas Jefferson end up writing that draft of the Declaration to present to Congress for edits? He was available. He wasn't busy, okay? So it was a very, very busy Congress. John Adams was super busy. He was on a million committees. Jefferson was a baby. He wasn't on any committees. He wasn't very social. So he had time and he wrote pretty well. So when they decided to declare independence and they needed to draft a preamble to explain why they were doing this, they always set up a committee. And it always worked where the person who got the most votes to be on the committee would chair the committee and be the lead drafter. And John Adams was super busy as he was on several other committees. He worked the hustings and he made sure that Jefferson got elected first. He came in second, then Franklin, Sherman, Robert Livingston. 4 Northerners, 1 Southerner. Important point there. And at the end of the day, so then, yes, Jefferson walks away with the credit. That's the stealing of our patrimony, okay? Our patrimony was a bunch of people who already thought enslavement was wrong. Another person was James Wilson, who there's lots to be said about the Constitution as well in this, but Wilson believed that the structure of the Constitution was one that would necessarily lead to the end of enslavement. And so we have to see the moment of the writing of the Constitution as a point where 2 people or 2 different factions were putting different hypotheses on the table. One faction had the hypothesis, this Constitution will lead to the end of enslavement. The other faction had the hypothesis, this Constitution will permit preserving enslavement. We know which hypothesis was proven right, okay? So the point just is that, yes, there were absolutely people who defended enslavement who never thought that the Declaration should be ours, okay, who didn't think it should belong to women and the like. But there were people who did think that its patrimony was universal, and we're already working in that direction. And it's their story and their history that I think we ought to reclaim, we ought to tell, and I'm happy to own it as my own.
Thank you. I'm going to ask 2 more questions and then turn it over to our audience for Q&A. You have written at length and eloquently and insightfully about policy and structure, governmentality. I wonder if you would share your thoughts with us, please, about what I might call small d democracy, protest, dissent, right? If I were to say something along the lines of maybe democracy begins with movements, it maybe begins in the streets and in communities, and then only later works its way to a legislature, what might you say to that?
Well, I honestly think it's a little bit of chicken and egg. I do think that social movements are a necessary part of the functioning of any healthy democracy. And I will point everybody to another commission report, this one called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. It came out in early March. It was sponsored by the NEH and US Department of Education. And again, I was fortunate to co-chair this body of work with a large group of wonderful people. And it is a roadmap to rebuilding excellence in history and civic learning for all learners. And so it's a question of how do we teach about our democracy? How do we teach about our history and the like? And one of the most important contributions of the roadmap, I believe, is to include social movements as something that we need to teach about alongside 3 branches of government, alongside the question of how the media and freedom of expression provide a sort of 4th estate for our democracy. So yes, social movements are a part of the basic equipment of a healthy democracy. And, I think it's a sort of symbiotic relationship between social movements and the legislature. So, chicken and egg, they need each other.
Great, thank you. One last one, and then I'll turn it over for audience questions. Your new book is titled Democracy in the Time of Coronavirus. It's not out yet, so we can't read it yet. Would you please give us a preview? Oh my goodness. Oh, sure. Gosh. Well, we've lived through quite some time. We're still living through it. Yeah, here we are nearly coming up on 2 years of experience with COVID-19. And for me, it was a life-changing experience. I'm fortunate it wasn't life-changing through the loss of a loved one, but it was life-changing because I was so shocked at the outset by the insufficiency of response from a variety of leaders across our society, elected and unelected, a whole slew. And as a result, I jumped in and I did a lot of COVID response work, worked really hard, pulled together a big network of experts and practitioners and mayors and community advocates, and put together the first national policy roadmap advocating for a real ramp up of public investment in testing and contact tracing. And then worked really hard to try to drive policy at the federal level and state levels to try to ensure we had the infrastructure in place that we needed to minimize the impact of the pandemic. And we all know the story. Here we are, 650-some thousand people later. We didn't do it. We didn't do our job. We didn't do the job we could have done. And so the question is why? And my answer to that question is because our democracy is in really pretty rough shape. And we have to understand its weaknesses in order to understand what's happened in this pandemic and in order to address them so that we do not leave ourselves in this position in the future, but can rebuild civic strength for our democracy. So that's what the book's about, sort of like what happened, why was our democracy so weak, what were the weaknesses about, and how can we fix them? Thank you. I look forward to reading it. Yeah. And with that, I'll turn it over to Riley and Kathy for audience questions. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for your terrific questions. Kathy, Riley, looking forward to it as well. Sorry, I got confused by the order previously. I think you're muted.
Kathy, you're muted.
You would think after a year plus of this, we'd all have it down. Well, thank you so much
for your really provocative comments, and know that you've got a few questions out here in the official question answers, but I also have been back channeled by several people saying how provocative your comments have been. One has tears in her eyes. So again, thank you so much. All right. I'm going to start with the first question that we have out here, which is very long. And so I'm going to try to both synthesize it as well as mix it with some comments that I have heard from others. And this participant asked the question that, could it be that the intense dissatisfaction with representative government today in part derives from an unarticulated realization that it isn't really so democratic? And in fact has pointed out that elections tend to elect from the highest level of society, something that was brought up by Aristotle. Others have mentioned, why are you so holding on to some of these old documents when we've got, for example, the provocative statement of Audre Lorde, you can never use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, right? So the first part is kind of like a little wanting to understand a little bit more about your holding on to these old documents and really seeing them as living for today. And then our first questioner wants to know what you think about having a third chamber of Congress, the Senate, the House, and then one that would mirror more of how we do juries. You are just selected and you need to serve. That would be true representative democracy. So two kind of different questions, both going to kind of your interest in kind of the use of the founding documents of the country.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Let me start with the question that referenced Audre Lorde first, and then come back to the question about whether our alienation from our democracy requires reform, and really radical reform to our institutions, because it's not democratic currently. So with regard to the first, the short of it is, I am fundamentally a philosopher, okay? And so I consider my job, when I am presented with any set of ideas, to understand their strengths and weaknesses. And so when I am presented with something like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, I don't just take it as given. My job is to take it apart, to understand what it's doing and why. And as I have contemplated and worked on the question of the relationship between ideas and the histories of race and racism and domination in our country, I have always wanted to ask the question of how the structures of ideas from point to point have made that possible. So when I dig into the Declaration of Independence, I'm looking for what's good in it, what's viable and accurate, but I'm also looking for where they went wrong. And the reason I'm looking for where they went wrong conceptually is because I don't actually believe we can build the tools we need unless we know precisely conceptually where they went wrong. So we can see where they went wrong in our lives. We feel where it went wrong all the time, but in order to build a new track for us in some sense to ride along on, I think we have to know where the conceptual mistakes came in, and then we can build the tools that we need. So to take the Declaration of Independence as an example, there is a mistake in the Declaration of Independence. It's not that it's a perfect text by any stretch of the imagination. It is a powerful articulation of what self-government requires. But the thing that was the mistake made actually comes in exactly the same place that I was quoting when they talk about the need to lay the foundation on principle and organize the powers of government in a particular form. They relied on this distinction in order to support patriarchal and racist forms of government, explicitly and self-consciously. So for example, when John Adams was pushed about what about women? What about the role of women? Don't women deserve a place in this? And when he was pushed about poor people, and when he was pushed about, in the language of the time, Negroes, he gave roughly the same answer. What he said was, the principles apply to everybody. The notion that the point here is to secure happiness and protect rights, that's for everybody. But as for how we organize the powers of government, for that, he literally said, we are going to use our masculine system of power, by which he meant white men holding power, would be the people who held power. So they use that distinction to justify the patriarchal and racist system of government. And the basic mistake, conceptual mistake, I mean, obviously it's an injustice, but in addition, there's a conceptual mistake. And the conceptual mistake was to believe that it was possible in any way to deliver happiness for all when power was held only by some. We know that power held absolutely corrupts. All of human history has known that. So that is where the mistake came in. And so, a version of the Declaration written today would need to be explicit that power needs to be in the hands of all if we're to have any chance of laying a foundation of principle on a concept of rights for all. Okay, so that's what I believe my job is to figure out exactly where the conceptual errors were, because then lots of other things follow from that as we seek to reform and renew.
All right. Fascinating. That honestly to me says this is a document that was made collectively, as you said, not by an individual, but collectively. But honestly, there was an error in it, but that error doesn't mean that it's fundamentally flawed. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, also for me, all these texts are just starting points. It's not as if it's not as if our job is just to wrap ourselves in them and leave it at that. Okay. They're tools for thinking and they're tools for learning. And I believe that one can learn profoundly from the Declaration of Independence. I have learned profoundly from it. I think lots of what I've learned is valuable, and that I've also been able to find the errors. And then in finding the errors, I find that that's a further prompt to further thinking and learning, which has been a real spur for innovation for me and for my own effort to change and transform institutions. So at any rate, that was a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. So would then your answer to the participants' suggestion that we need a third chamber of Congress be, hang on, not really? Or what he or she honestly don't know?
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, I do think that there is room within our institutions for us to add in those, what people often call deliberative juries as a part of the process. I wouldn't add it as a third chamber of Congress. I think that would in various ways, the works are already gummed up, and in various ways, I think that would further gum up the works. But I do think, and actually it's in our common purpose report, we have some recommendations around the places that we think that those kinds of deliberative juries would actually be useful additions to our set of institutions.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to hand it over to Riley for the next person's question.
Yeah, I know I will say before I do get into the next question that I just want to acknowledge that I really appreciate your answer about where you discuss how you go into the Declaration and see, where they went wrong. I think sometimes, so often we will have people who work within the federal government or even state governments who are so bent on maybe just keeping the document alive where it was in time instead of using it as a tool to think about how we can adapt to the times that we're in now and creating a sense of equality. I know that's one take that I've really learned in school, and I just really appreciate you making those comments as well. But I will move on to the next question. So we have our question here. She says, thank you, Dr. Allen, for your inspiring and thought-provoking remarks. It seems to me that an important element of the virtuous circle would be communication. Dialogue must be open, authentic, and must include listening, not just shouting into the wind or onto social media. Do you have any thoughts on how to promote productive civic and civil dialogue in support of our democratic project, particularly on the community or at the small scale level?
So one of my favorite examples of a solution like that is an organization in Lexington, Kentucky called Civic Lex. And I laugh because I just always bring this up. It's one of my favorite. In the same way I love the Declaration of Independence, I also love Civic Lex. Anyway, it's a small organization that has taken on the job of trying to rebuild investigative journalism at the local level in Lexington, Kentucky. So that as municipal government is making decisions, as county government is making decisions, that those will be aired and that the public can participate in that. And it's a digital platform, so it's it's sort of digital space. But in addition to the basic kind of journalistic work that they do, they also sponsor community conversations. And they have a really interesting principle for these that I think is really transformative. They structure them so that there are never more than 7 constituents, 7 community members per public official, right? So a rule of 7 to 1. And the basic idea here is that, you know, when you're in that kind of ratio, you have to be responsible for the quality of your interactions with others. So if our social media life is kind of like permanent middle school, where we're just like constantly bullying and trolling each other, then, you know, I think what Civic Lex is building is something I would call civic media. I think is what we can grow up into. But what it requires is that we actually build in intentionality about the quality of our relationships with each other. So that's what I would hold up as a great example of how to start rebuilding our potential for communication.
Yeah, I love that. I know this may be for our audience a sneak peek of what our Democracy Lab is doing, is really a cohort of people, whether it's the university or within the community, to start having more conversations about what are some of the grand challenges that we're having in our democracy, not just in Wyoming, but in the Rocky Mountain region and within the United States writ large. So you gave me a really great idea that I'm going to go research soon. So thank you.
Fantastic.
And I'll hand it over to Kathy.
Great.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes from a participant who is curious about what she's calling the deterioration of the respect for the institution of education, and seeing education as absolutely pivotal in a democratic society. And curious about your thoughts about that, the role of education in particular, high school and post-secondary. And I'll even throw in the assaults that we're seeing on, for example, the teaching, honestly, of history, and in particular, the, referring to any mention of race as being an inappropriate exposure to critical race theory to our youngest students.
Right. Yeah. So this is a very hard problem that we are facing, and I think that we have to solve it by building networks of people who share a commitment to honesty in education, honesty in history. And, I recognize that right now in many states, Arizona, for example, I don't know what the situation is in Wyoming, it's very hard for teachers and educators where states have passed laws, prohibiting teaching, and in various ways having a chilling effect. So even if the laws are, sort of this side of the line of what's, sustainable, legally speaking, they have a broader chilling effect on educators. So the question is really, how can we change the dynamic on that? And I think that a thing we really have to work hard to do actually is to work through family engagement at the K through 12 level. I think we need to support principals and teachers in working with families to build up understanding of what and why teachers are doing, and to more or less re-win legitimacy for the project. In other words, what I'm trying to articulate is there's a sort of a big attack on the legitimacy of history education as it's commonly practiced right now. And I don't think we solve that problem of a legitimacy attack from the top down. I think we actually have to go back to kind of grassroots work of winning hearts and minds, community by community. And I think it's going to be very, very labor intensive, but I'm not sure there's another solution to the problem.
Just go a little bit further. When you said it will be labor intensive, whose labor are you imagining?
Right. Well, I'll just give you a very concrete example. I'm sorry, I know I'm speaking kind of abstractly. So I have built a civic education provider over the last period of years here in Massachusetts, and we have developed a grade 8 curriculum called Civic Engagement in Our Democracy. And we include in the curriculum certainly history around enslavement, the history of enslavement, and some history around race and racism. We also have portions of the curriculum that are about young people's civic identities, and to engage a young person in thinking about their civic identity is to engage them in thinking about their identity more broadly. And that means ethnic identity and sexual identity, and it means religious identity and cultural identity, and the whole kit and caboodle, whatever a kid wants to put on the table as relevant to themselves. And so that work, as you might imagine, does encounter some of the challenges that you just described. Families raising questions about, should their kids be taught to think about identity, for example. And so the conclusion we've come to in doing this work for several years is that the most important thing we can do, by we here means those of us who are the curriculum designers and the educators we work with, the teachers we work with, and then the principals and the schools that support them, is work really hard actually to engage families more broadly in civic learning processes as well. To invite everybody in, to show people what we're doing and why, to be really clear about the motivations and justifications, and again, to work, sort of classroom by classroom, to win parents to the project of doing this work with their students. And I think part of what happens in the large public fights about things like CRT is there's a real caricature out there. And the point of the family engagement work is to cut through the caricature so that people can see what's really going on and make judgments based on actual facts about, what they think for their kids. So our experience is when we're able to sit and work with families and walk them through the curriculum and answer their questions and the like, and hear their concerns and sometimes respond to their concerns where they have found a place where we can make improvements and the like, they're with us. They're ready to have their students engage in honest history and civic learning and the like. But it really is at that level of with the classroom, with the family, educators and the curriculum designers supporting them, I think ultimately are going to have to do this work.
What a great sounding project, really, really. And is it in Massachusetts?
Yep, in Massachusetts.
Okay. Oh, great. Yeah. Riley, you're up.
Yes. I have an audience member here who says, I've been reading and teaching the Great Law of Peace, the body of law developed by the Haudenosaunee Confederation. It strikes me that now is a timely opportunity to look even earlier than the Declaration of Independence to consider an indigenous philosophy of government that arguably influenced the founding of the US. Do you think 21st century democracy can also include a deeper turning to indigenous foundations? Yep,
we certainly have indigenous political thinking and political structures in our curriculum. We think it's time for that. And I'll say something else as well. Another thing that we do is very often Americans don't realize that tribal treaties have the same status as the Constitution. That is, tribal treaties govern legal relationships in the same way that the Constitution governs legal relationships, and for different communities. So in our curriculum, we teach tribal treaties alongside teaching the Constitution so that the full legal architecture of our society is visible to students.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's also helpful to conceptualize how indigenous foundations have really influenced even United States working documents from very early on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things is, I mean, that's certainly true. And lots of folks will talk about the Iroquois Confederation often. And, it's also the case that if you look into Aztec history, you'll find actually, a theories of federalism that predate our own theories of federalism. It's unlikely that there were sort of direct links of transmission there, but there's certainly an earlier example of an understanding of the value of federalism in our own case.
Fascinating.
It is fascinating. It's like it's a whole beautiful field of things to know and understand. And when I was a kid, in school, I used to ask my teachers questions about, what did enslaved people experience, what were their lives like, what happened if an enslaved person ran away or things like that. And my teachers, well-meaning people, all of them, would tell me over and over again, there's no way we could know that, Danielle. It's impossible to know. We don't, enslaved people didn't write, we don't have records, et cetera. And, here now I'm 45 years later, after the point at which I was asking those questions, historians have been working for decades, and we can answer all those questions now. We know the answers. There are written records. And in addition to written records, we've found so many other bodies of evidence to use to answer these questions. And this has just been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, is to see this transition to a place where we know what enslaved people experienced. And I think we have the same riches available to us for thinking about indigenous history and really coming to understand in a deep way Native American history in this country. And so, that for me is a source of great joy, that things that we were told at one point were impossible to know are knowable. And I do really think that it's incumbent on all of us to integrate these incredible riches of understanding into our shared history.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Kathy,
Okay.
you have our next question.
All right, so a participant wants to know or says, I want to think that the relationship among our three branches of government is self-correcting. That is, dominance by one energizes one or both of the other branches. What do you think?
Well, that was certainly the point. But, things have changed over time. Most significantly, the executive branch has grown in power far beyond what was originally imagined for it. So that's a real question. How do we feel about that? The legislative branch is weak. It no longer really functions as the first branch of government. I believe we actually ought to be working to restore its status as the first branch of government and achieving a healthy legislature for ourselves. I don't actually think you can have a sustainable constitutional democracy with a weak legislature. So from my point of view, we have a lot of work to do to bring things back in balance. And then, of course, there's the problem of the Supreme Court having become highly polarized and being too closely connected to presidential elections. Hence, in our report, as I mentioned, the recommendation for term limits for Supreme Court justices, so that every presidential term every 4 years would bring 2 appointments of a justice. And then elections for the executive wouldn't become identical to elections for the court. We need to let those things come apart again so that those bodies can actually be equilibrating in relationship to each other.
Thanks. So for participants out there, feel free to ask more questions and put them in the question and answer function. But Dr. Allen, I'll ask you now, as you think about the challenges before us right now, right? I know you think about the past really in rich kinds of way, as well as visions for the future. But if you were to think about the next 5, 10 years of the challenges, what's the work that you think is before us?
Well, let me give you back to your university president and the idea that a grand challenge can't be solved in 10 years.
I did think of that.
Let me give you the hardest problem that I know of, which I hope we could solve it within 10 years, but it is also, I think, the hardest problem that I know of. This is the following. So we all know we're driven by polarization and factionalism and things of that kind. And it's not new, it was a concern as well in the founding era. The people who drafted the Constitution had as one goal to try to fend off the danger of faction in their vocabulary. And James Madison in the Federalist Papers in essay number 10 offered an argument for how the Constitution was supposed to solve the problem of faction. Of course, it couldn't solve it completely, but mitigate it to such a degree that it wouldn't undermine healthy governance and healthy functioning. And we often, in reading Federalist 10, focus just on one half of his argument. So this is the essay where he argues that representation is what will solve the problem of faction. And when we focus on that part, we focus on the basic idea that representatives are supposed to be elected who have the job of mediating and filtering opinions so that extreme views don't become the decisive views, but you get a kind of synthesis and a kind of more moderate decision. But there's a second part to Madison's argument, which we typically overlook. The second part to his argument was that what was going to make this work was geographic dispersal. The size of the country and, it's being broken up by rivers and mountains and the like, which would make it very hard, he expected, for people with extreme views to find each other. They wouldn't be able to coordinate. And as a result, they would have to go through representatives to get their views into the public sphere. And that geographic forcing function then would be what made representation work to keep faction under control. So you can see where I'm going with this probably, right? The invention of social media in 2005 knocked that pillar out from under the entire design, okay? So in other words, our entire system of representation, its design, its functionality to suppress faction or to mediate it, moderate, break it up so that it would be manageable. The whole thing rested on a premise of geographic dispersion and the difficulty of coordinating across geographies. That's gone. So how do we redesign representation to do the work it needs to do for us to have healthy, equilibrated decision-making when we no longer have geography to help us?
All right, so what do you think about, for example, Wyoming right now? Wyoming has 2 senators and 1 representative, right? We are overwhelmingly overrepresented in Congress.
Yeah. Well, I think we should increase the size of Congress, but not give you guys any more seats. It's the short of it. And then let the Wyoming ratio be the ratio that is the minimum ratio for any other state, and build out Congress around that ratio. So yes, so I'm sorry, but I do think that we need to rebalance in ways that make the representation in Wyoming more proportional to the population in Wyoming. But even with that rule that I just described, it's still, it wouldn't be to disappear Wyoming's representation at all. Certainly, it's only Congress that I'm proposing change in this way, not the Senate, right? So there would still be the kind of over representation, so to speak, in the Senate, but counterbalanced by a more truly proportional representation in Congress.
What about, we'll go back to the initial question, the questioner who was, I'm not going to say cynical, but pointing out that our election system tends to elect those who can be elected. It takes a lot of money, lot of money.
Yeah.
We see a disproportionate number of older white men, for example, right? And those from a wealthier class.
Yep.
So how do you defend representative democracy when who gets elected is not that representation that you're talking about?
Well, I'm not defending the status quo, So, I mean, I think that's the entire point of the structure of reforms that are recommended. Another of the reforms in our common purpose is ranked choice voting, which every place it's in use has increase the diversity both of candidates and of elected officials. And we just saw this in New York, where the diversity of the city council is now much greater, many more women represented on the New York City Council. I also do think that there are improvements to public financing of campaigns that we can make to also open up space for people to compete more effectively. And then I want to really just hold up, organizations that are working really hard to build up and empower candidates from non-traditional backgrounds. It's partly money, yes, but it's not just money. It's also, people being told, what are you doing running? I think the sort of ratio of, frequency with which some categories of people hear that compared to others, is disempowering. So it's many things, and I think that we need to change them, is the short of it. So I wouldn't defend how our system currently operates. That's why we need, as our report says, the reinvention of democracy for the 21st century. It's time.
Great, thanks. Briley?
Yes, so we do have a question in the chat, and something I am very interested in hearing your answer to as well. This person says that an eminent scholar of Weimar, Germany wrote in 2008 that the threats to democracy are not always from enemies abroad. They can come from those within who espouse the language of democracy and use the liberties afforded to them by democratic institutions to undermine the substance of democracy. Weimar cautions us to be wary of those people, and what comes next can be very bad, even worse than the imaginable. Do you see a similar situation in the US currently?
Well, you can hear in all of my answers that I believe in the value of institutions, okay? And that is something that I think is hard. I think there are lots of people now who don't believe in the value of institutions. But the value of institutions, from my point of view, is that they, in a constitutional democracy, we use them to do what I call depersonalizing power. So the point is that it's never about the power of this person or that person. That's not the point of a political system. The question is, can we deliver for the public good? Can we deliver good governance? And that means what we want is decisions that are coming out of collective processes that are not really, to the advantage of this particular person or that, are not about building up any particular person's power. And it's very hard to build institutions that routinely do a good job of depersonalizing power and distributing it, decentering it, and the like. And so, yes, I mean, it is entirely possible for somebody to drive the machinery of institutions in such a way that they then repersonalize power and they start to undermine process in order that power be centralized with them and that they become a more powerful person. Orban in Hungary is a really good example of this. So he was an elected official who has took the reins of government there and has used the reins of government consistently to sort of knock down institution, knock down process, and consolidate power directly in his own hands. That's the danger. That's a danger. It's a danger where democracy is weak. I think we're vulnerable on that front as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
All right, there's now a lot of chatter going on. We've got participants arguing with each other and with you, and it's kind of fun to think about how to put these together in our last 10 or 12 minutes here.
Well, I mean, I do realize I sidestepped the question everybody actually had there. I mean, and yes, I did sidestep it. So maybe I should say something about why did I sidestep the question, which is implicitly a question, I presume, about our previous president. So good question. So why did I sidestep it? I mean, I certainly wrote in such a way with worries about then Donald Trump before he was elected in 2016, concerns about what his leadership approach meant for the country. So it's a position that I have, a critique I've articulated. I don't actually think it's helpful right now. Why is that exactly? I guess because I think that we litigated his administration with the impeachment hearing, and it didn't achieve a supermajority vote, but it did achieve a majority vote in terms of an assessment of what his his contribution to January 6th had been. And never in our history have we achieved an impeachment vote at that kind of that level. And I think we have a commission operating as well that's digging into that further, and I think we need to let them do their work. And I think those formal processes of litigation are valuable. And I think I myself at this point find it more useful to consider the many different ways in which our democracy is weak and the many different ways in which we exhibit weakness as a democracy, and then to try to figure out how to fix those rather than to sort of relitigate the specifics of that particular president, particularly when we also have formal processes underway doing just that.
Okay, so let me follow up with kind of mixing two questions which seem to follow up a little bit. One is that it seems that the most vocal and angry are interested in getting into politics, and the others are not willing to engage in politics or community work. And then there is the concern about, even with kind of a representative democracy, whose voices are not being heard or not being heard well enough. And one example of being the poor, which are getting bigger and bigger in comparison to the rich.
Yep. Well, this just comes back to that grand challenge, Kathy, that your democracy lab is going to solve. This is it. Like, this is the core of our biggest, hardest challenge. Those louder voices that are too loud, the bullying voices that are starting to intimidate others into silence and into non-participation. That is what a functioning system of representation is supposed to not prohibit, not in the sense of ban, but the incentive structures are supposed to operate in a way that that's not possible. And relatedly, the incentive structures of representation should operate in such a way that the voices of the poor are heard, that all voices are empowered and flowing into the shared processes of deliberation and decision-making that are the heart of free self-government. So I would agree with all implicit questions that are asking, is our system of representation broken? Yes, it is. And I think that basically Facebook broke it. It's not the only thing that broke it. Money in politics broke it too. There's a lot of stuff. But yes, I would agree with people who think it's broken. And so that's why I'm glad the Democracy Lab exists, because I truly believe this is a constitutional moment we're living in, actually, and that we have to do the work of constitutional designers. And the work of constitutional design is to achieve what Abigail Adams, okay, because she saw the philosophical mistake too, what she said the standard should be, which was full voice and representation for everybody. That had to be the standard. And what we also know is that full voice and representation has to come with sort of way of organizing the public sphere, where as the voices kind of assemble together, you have something healthy and productive, not something violent and bullying. So we know what the job is, right? That's what we have to build. Now, the hard part is to figure out how to do that. That's the grand challenge thing again that we need you guys for.
Well, you're giving us our marching orders, but I've got a follow-up question, and I'm using my other hat as someone who serves in the legislature. We regularly get emails from people who want to hold a constitutional convention. They want to rework the Constitution. What do you think of that?
Yeah. Well, you can come back to the Declaration of Independence again. So after they give us that, theory of revolution, that you got, we all have rights, build government to protect rights. If government's not securing rights, then it's our right to alter or to abolish it, right? And to lay the foundations of new government, institute new government. After they say that, the next sentence is, government should not be changed for light and transient causes. And then they go through an account of just how much work they've put into reform to prove that reform was impossible, right? So they put in a decade's worth of work on reform before they came to the conclusion that reform was impossible and they had to have a revolution. And so I continue to believe that that's the sort of basic approach one should take, that one should be pursuing pathways of reform. And to some extent, any pathway of reform is most successful if you choose the most feasible lever to pull, which means, you get to the constitutional measures last. Okay, so coming back to our common purpose report again, we've got 31 recommendations. We wanted them to be bold and impactful, but also feasible and to drive change in the near term. So out of those 31, we only proposed one constitutional amendment because we wanted to make sure that we could get maximum value for the effort people would be putting in on change and reform. So this is a long-winded way of saying that I don't think by any stretch of the imagination we've actually exhausted the pathway of reform. And I think that there are plenty of levers that we can pull at the level of state law, at the level of federal law, at the level of institutional and organizational practice. And we need to be pulling all of those and pulling in shared directions consistently for a decade before we could even ask that question about a constitutional convention.
Great, thank you. Riley, switch gears for us.
So this, I guess, is a less of an abstract question, but one that is about the work you did regarding the commission you were on. So in our common purpose, what are the most surprising and exciting recommendations to you? What is the status of those recommendations and how might you see those get enacted?
Well, so I've mentioned some of the ones I'm most excited about: increasing the size of the House, which is also a way of rebalancing the Electoral College, I note. So it's actually increasing the size of the House is an answer to the question of what we should do about the Electoral College. The Supreme Court term limits, another important one. So what's the one constitutional amendment? Somebody out there must have been wondering that when I said we had one constitutional amendment. That is to address money in politics. So it's an amendment to undo the impact of Citizens United. There are also recommendations around public financing for campaigns and for transparency and disclosure around people who are funding campaigns. And then, I'll share one more, which actually, as we've all watched the negotiations in Congress currently, that started out with HR 1, the For the People Act, and now has been replaced by, I can't remember what it's called, but Joe Manchin's Every Person Votes Act or something like that. There's a sort of compromise version of a democracy reform bill now in Congress, and the compromise version has a very similar footprint to the recommendations in our report. So to your question about status, take a look at Manchin's bill, that would be what the current status is of a lot of the recommendations. And one of them in there, for what it's worth, is to make our national federal election day a national holiday in support of fuller participation. Kathy, that's one way of ensuring that the voices of lower income people are more likely to be included, by making sure it's a paid holiday for people so that they can get to the polls.
Yeah, good point. Maybe one more question from the question and answer, and then we'll let you, if you have any kind of closing comments, but here's one more. Do you think that an originalist reading of the Constitution misses your very valuable point regarding the Declaration of Independence? That in a sense, we're reading a text that captures a series of debates among the authors.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, yes. That was a nice one. I could answer that with one word for a change. Yes, exactly. Couldn't be better said. Yes.
Oh, all right. All right. Well, then we'll just leave it at that. And closing comments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Well, no, I mean, thank you so much. These were great, great questions. And it's wonderful to see a community engaged with so much passion and creativity in the question of the health and future of our democracy. And I do have high hopes for your democracy lab. I'm not kidding when I'm saying to you, I hope that you can solve this challenge about representation. I truly think it is the challenge for our democracy. And I've been putting this out there for other people as well. I'm still waiting for somebody to sort of embrace it with both hands and say, yes, you know, we're gonna step up and really dig into this. The report, Our Common Purpose, is a first pass at an effort to answer the question about how we reform representation to address the problems that were named, the problems of excluded voices of poor people, for example, the problem of money in politics, the problem of polarization, and the problem of demagoguery. You know, that we are trying to address all of those things in the report, but I'm pretty sure that ours is just a first pass and that further work is needed. So I think that your democracy lab couldn't be launching at a more important time, and really excited to see what Wyoming will contribute to our finding our way forward.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Allen, and to everybody that is attending this event. That about wraps up our night. I just want to give a huge thank you to you, Dr. Allen, for being with us tonight and having this much needed conversation with us. I know I learned so much, and I hope our audience members did as well. While many of us may not be students, this is all a learning and reflective moment about how we can begin to think about the moment in time we are in historically, and what we as individuals can do with our fellow Americans and Wyomingites when we're addressing some of these grand challenges. I know tonight, I think we had a really great conversation about dialogue and finding shared values with those that may disagree with you to cultivate a better sense of democracy, our common purpose as American citizens, and ultimately challenging the systems we have in place with new and adaptive ideas while still using the foundational tools in which our country was built upon. I do very much agree with you that we are in a constitutional moment, something that, something's not working here, and I think people are really eager to get to work to change our systems for the better, and ones that account for what is lacking. So disproportionate representation, lack of acknowledging racist and patriarchal systems that continue to subjugate people, and the plethora of other issues that we had discussed tonight. And so in the Democracy Lab, and as well as many other humanities institutes across the nation, we are here to address those grand challenges. Maybe not within 10 years, but still within this lapse of time that we are in. As Sean had also mentioned in the first half of our talk, we are the Democracy Lab, a group out of the Wyoming Institute of Humanities that aims to tackle some grand challenges we face in the state of Wyoming and in the Rocky Mountain region. And I want to thank you again, Dr. Allen, because this talk will be incredibly informative for the continued work that we do at the Democracy Lab. This is just the beginning of our work, and I'm so eager, as well as my other colleagues in the lab, to get our hands dirty and start thinking about the ways we can turn these discussions into actionable items, and really start talking more with our community members about how we can start shifting and fostering a better democracy. And so if our audience members are interested in the work that we do, please visit the Wyoming Institute of Humanities website and look out for other events and involvement opportunities we will be having in the coming months. Again, thank you all so much for your support. Stay safe out there and have a wonderful night.
Yeah, likewise.
A
Thank
clap
you.
for all of there were so many participants on here at one point that I had seen. Thank you so much, Dr. Allen.
My pleasure. It was great to be with you all. Very good luck to your work. Alrighty. Good night.